In this installment of A Journey into Joinery, we're going to take a look at making a mortise using your handheld router and a jig that we designed and presented way back in issue number 2 of Woodworking at Home magazine. Now, we won't be going through the specifics on how to make this jig, as we've already covered it once, but we'll be going through and demonstrating how you can use this jig to cut a very precise mortise. And this type of mortise has some advantages and some disadvantages. But first, we'll walk you through real quickly on how you go about setting up the jig, cutting your mortise, and then we'll look at the details. For this type of cutting operation, it really works out best to have a spiral router bit. This is a solid carbide router bit. It's 3/8 inch diameter, 1/2 inch shank, and it's made by Whiteside. Performs very well for this application. Having a right-hand spiral helps to eject the chips out of the mortise as we're cutting it. Now, to help guide the router while we're making the mortising cut, I'm using a collar affixed to the base. This happens to be the largest one that I had available when we made the jig. And here's the jig. It's a very simple jig. It's got a platform, a fence that locates the work and allows us to clamp the jig to the work. The fence is adjustable to set the position of where we want the mortise relative to the fence. Here's our slot. The width of this slot is calibrated so that it's the same size as the bushing is, or the collar is, on the router. And then we've got another stop over here that allows you to set the length of the mortise. Very simple jig, very easy to make, and again we show how to do that back in issue number 2. Now, when setting up the jig on your workpiece, you have to take into account the diameter of your collar and the diameter of your router bit. And you'll have to, of course, make sure you allow for the offset distance, or the distance from the edge of the collar to the edge of the router bit. But other than that, it's just a little bit of layout work on your workpiece to set the position of where you want the mortise, and then setting the jig up, and you're ready to make as many mortises as you want. Now, to do the layout, I'm starting out, I want my mortise to be at 1 inch up from the end and a total of 2 inches long. Now, to account for the offset of the distance or difference between my router bit and the collar, I've got to go 3/16 of an inch on both extreme ends of that, making the layout a little bit longer. Now we can bring our jig into position and set that up. Now, this slot in my jig is 3/4 of an inch. So if I want my mortise centrally located on a 3/4 inch board, all I have to do is line it up right on the width, so that the width is the same as the thickness of my stock. Now, for my length, we just simply bring our jig over, line up the one layout mark, line up the other layout mark, and now we're ready to clamp the jig onto our workpiece and cut out that mortise. Now, to set our cutting depth for our router bit, we have to remember that the base of the router is going to be 3/4 of an inch above our work. So I know I've got 3/4 of an inch of dead space, and I want this particular mortise to be 1 inch deep. So I need to set my router bit to a 1 3/4 inch projection from the base. Then I'll bring my stop rod into position and lock that. Now, you really shouldn't just take and start up the router, plunge it to full depth, and cut across. It's going to really load up that router bit, and it's not going to be able to eject the chips. So there's basically 2 ways you can rough out the mortise, and it will depend somewhat on the diameter of the router bit that you're using. You can start out by plunging the router down, moving it over like so, taking it to full depth on each cut. And that'll remove the bulk of the material. Then you can come back, go to full depth, and then feed across to finish it up and smooth out the sides. The other option is to bring it down, feed in about 1/8 or 3/16 of an inch, feed across, come back, feed down a little bit further, feed across, come back, and so forth. Both techniques seem to work very well. It's just a matter of personal preference. I find that with a 1/4 inch diameter router bit, it generally works out better to just do your plunging cuts like so to do the roughing operations. But once you get up to around a 3/8 inch or a 1/2 inch router bit, they're pretty solid, so taking sideways cuts works out pretty effectively. Now if your router bit has dust collection and you actually have it hooked up to operate, you can extract most of the chips out. However, if you don't have dust collection, you'll find that the chips will build up inside here, preventing the collar from sliding back and forth along its full travel. So you may have to stop from time to time to clean out that debris. And after just a few moments with the router, we've got our completed mortise. Now what we're going to do is take a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of cutting a mortise in this fashion. The first disadvantage that you'll notice right away is that the ends of the mortise are rounded. Now, of course, if your tenon is rounded on the edges like so, it's not an issue. However, if you've machined your tenons over at the table saw or with hand cutting, chances are you'll have square ends. So if you've got this type of tenon and it has to fit in this type of mortise, take a chisel, square up the ends. Requires very little work and effort to square up the ends like so. Now, if you're using loose tenon joinery, in this case, this happens to be some cherry stock that I machined up a long time ago. I just simply rip it to width of the mortise, and then I just run it over the router table, rounding over the edges so that the edges match up with the shape at the end of the mortise. Works out very efficiently. And this is loose tenon joinery. You would just make up a bunch of this blank stock, cut it up to the lengths that you need as you go along. Very popular joinery method. Another drawback to this type of mortising operation is the type of router bits that you have to use. Ideally, you want a right-hand helix or a spiral flute router bit, preferably solid carbide, but the length gets to be an issue. This one's a pretty standard length here, and you can get them much longer. The longer the tool, the less rigid it is, and the more probability you'll have of the tool vibrating during cut. This is called chatter. Now, if that tool is vibrating back and forth side to side while it's cutting in there, it's going to cut that slot oversize. Now, if you're aware of it in advance, it's not a real big issue, but it is something that you have to be aware of when you get into this type of joinery. But all around, it does work fairly well. Now that we've cut it open, let's take a look at one of the biggest advantages to this type of mortising operation. Notice how smooth this surface is. It isn't all galled up. There aren't a lot of cut marks or scrape marks from either the chisels or any other types of hand operations. The bottom is square, it's flat, the side walls are perpendicular to the end, and it's very well machined. This creates a very perfect or near perfect gluing surface. So when we put our tenon in there and glue these two pieces together, we will have a much higher success rate of this glue joint lasting forever than if we had a hand chiseled surface or other type of machining operation wherein the surface is very coarse and very rough. Also, by machining it in this fashion, we know that this mortise is perpendicular to the face, so when we clamp things up together, chances are really good everything's going to come together square. The side walls, of course, are parallel to each other. The bottom is flat and it's at a consistent depth. So all around, it's a very accurately machined mortise. The primary advantage being a fantastic gluing surface. Now those are the advantages specific to the mortise itself, which is truly the most critical aspect of any type of joinery operation. If we want to use hand tools, but we can't achieve the precision and the nice fit and finish that we can with power tools, then there's really no advantage to doing it with hand tools. Now most shops have a handheld router. The router bits are very common, very easy to get a hold of today. Making up a jig to do this type of mortising operation is of course very easy, and we show you how to do that in issue number 2 of Woodworking at Home magazine. The machining operation is very efficient, and the setup is very fast and efficient as well. Now we're going to be showing you another way of cutting out the mortises in the next installment in this series, and then we'll be moving on to the tenons and a little bit more general discussion on mortise and tenon joinery. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.